Okay. Welcome, everybody. I apologize for the delay of about 5 or 6 minutes, but in this world of Zoom and international collaborations, unfortunately, this happens. So I want to welcome everybody. My name is Anthony Tamburri. I am the Dean of the John D. Calandra Italian American Institute, one of the sponsors, along with the Colorni-Hirschman International Institute. This is also sponsored in part by the Società Dante Alighieri of New York. And more significantly, I also wear the hat of one of the co-directors of Bordighera Press, which is the publisher of the series dedicated to the works of Eugenio Colorni. Why the Calandra Institute dedicated to the history and culture of Italians in America, or Italian Americans, or the Italian diaspora, depending on how you want to categorize that phenomenon of migration. Why are we doing also Eugenio Colorni? Because Colorni is part of Italian history, and we should know Italian history. We should be, we being the Italians or the children, grandchildren, etc., of Italian immigrants, we should know what's going on in Italy. And this is one of our ways to become more conversant and more familiar with the Academy. We have, with the history of Italy. We have a number of guests with us, international. We're here from Connecticut, New York, Rome, and we will be moving along quickly. We have some comments from a very dear friend of ours, Natalia Indrimi, who is the director of the Centro Primo Levi here in New York. Unfortunately, she's not able to join us because of the challenges of technology today and where we all are, etc. She sent us a recording, which I'm going to play, and then we'll pass on to Ernest Jalongo. So.
Good afternoon, everybody. It is with pleasure that I accepted Anthony Tamburri's invitation to say a few words for this program on Eugenio Colorni that the Calandra Institute presents with the Colorni-Hirschman International Institute. The initiative to publish Colorni's work in English allows a larger readership to appreciate immense concern for the limitations and dilemmas of the nation state, and what I would call its ad hoc imperial ambitions, something, an economy in which Colorni was very interested. Some of his most relevant work today was written from prison and from his underground existence, which Colorni led until he was murdered by the fascists in 1944, shortly before the liberation of Rome. Colorni and his friends, Altiero Spinelli, Ernesto Rossi, his wife Ursula Hirschman, and her brother Alberto, saw the constant tendency to conquer national political power as a self-destructive mechanism of the institution of the state and as a main propeller of war. So they tried to imagine other forms in which the democracy could flourish, mainly form what they called open federalism or international state that would allow new developments of societies. We can say today that some of their ideas became part of our political and cultural reality, but we also see that the ferments and mechanisms that Colorni denounced over 80 years ago are still very much alive and driving all sorts of new nationalistic and identitarian currents. So in this sense, I'm happy to see that different generations of scholars are taking interest in Colorni's work and in these topics. And I hope that it will help us ponder both on the going adrift of the civil institutions, but also on what in these institutions may be inherently problematic and may require serious reconsideration, something that certainly many people today are trying to do. And so this, I hope this will be the beginning of many conversations. The publication of Colorni's work in English is an extraordinary achievement. And I wish us all that we will be able to talk more and understand more of these topics. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And I want to thank Natalia for taking the time to send us that. As I said, we're just all pulled and pushed with Zoom, etc. Natalia is a very dear friend of the Institute, as is also Ernest Jalongo. We are members of the New York City and the CUNY Italian community at large. And so I'm delighted to present to you Ernest Jalongo.
Thanks, Anthony. Thanks for having me here and including me in all the Calandra events. I seem to be the historian on standby, which I'm happy to be. So I was very, very happy to have the opportunity to familiarize myself with Colorni through these recently translated works, and to think about how important Colorni is, both at the time as an historical source, especially with these materials now being available in English and as a primary source, but also how they continue to speak to us today in a way that Natalia just introduced. And I think my final comments will lead to the next person who's speaking as to why to bring Colorni to America. So what I found particularly interesting about these volumes is how prescient Colorni was, how he saw from the very beginning the need for a federation of Europe, but also as a prelude to a global federation, because as he said, he saw very clearly that after 2 world wars and the global destruction they wrought, he put it quite clearly, and I'm quoting from the preface to The Problems of the European Federation, the booklet that continued the Ventotenne Manifesto and published in 1944 and republished in volume 1 of the Colorni translations. He said, quote, "The basic contradiction responsible for the crises, war, misery, and exploitation afflicting our society was the existence of sovereign states that are geographically, economically, and militarily defined, which view other states as competitors and potential enemies, and live in a perpetual state of bellum omnium contra omnes, war of all against all, with respect to each other." He was also clear that building a European federation meant unlearning the habits since the beginning of the modern era and the emergence of the modern nation state. Existing political parties, he wrote, tied to a history of struggles fought within the confines of each nation, are by habit and tradition accustomed to defining all problems on the tacit assumption of the existence of the nation state, and considering problems at the international level of issues of foreign policy, to be resolved through diplomacy and agreement between various governments. His point was that to build a European federation, one must calibrate domestic decisions to the international arena, that we must finally come to grips with the idea that what happens in one country is not separate from the broader international community that we are perforce a part of. At the time, 1944, he noted that the World War had made the Nazis, let me start again. In 1944, he noted that the World War had made the point of federation achievable, partly because the hyper-nationalism of the fascists and Nazis had, quote, replaced the concept of national independence with that of living space, unquote, meaning borders and national autonomy had been virtually abolished in the seizure of empires. How much more accurate is that today, where in the face of the forces of globalization, either the interconnectedness of global trade or the seamless communication of one individual to another across the globe, the idea that we are islands amongst ourselves is just simply untrue. Furthermore, Colorni talked about seizing the opportunities caused by the devastation of the war, wherein the nationalism and militarism that had led to the war would force people to recognize the value of a federated union of Europe. As he wrote, quote, "The reason our movement arose is precisely this. It is the preeminence, the precedence of this problem over all the others that afflict us in the period we are now going through. It is the sure knowledge that if we let the situation re-solidify in the old nationalistic molds, the opportunity will be lost forever, and our continent will have no lasting peace and well-being." These words still matter to us today. After the rise of nationalist populism in Europe and America and elsewhere in the last few years, which threatened to tear apart the international organizations put in place after World War II to preserve regional and global stability, people once again are seizing the initiative of the moment to see the benefits and the needs of international comity. Britain left the European Union, but the Union endures, committed to preserving what it has achieved. The America of Trump threatened the global linkages across the Atlantic, but has been replaced by Biden and his recommitment to NATO and Europe. The Union specifically is recommitted to many of the very principles Colorni called for in 1944. These principles, he wrote, may be summarized as follows: a single federal army, a single currency, abolition of customs barriers and immigration limits among the Federation's member states, direct representation of citizens in federal assemblies, and a unified foreign policy, unquote. Whether these principles have in fact come about formally, for instance, the Euro, the Schengen Agreement on the pre-COVID free movement of peoples within European borders, the European Parliament, or have generally been put into practice in the coordination of military and foreign policy in NATO. Europe is fulfilling Colorni's prescient ideas from 77 years ago. Colorni was also prescient about the dangers of hyper-nationalism in an even earlier article, which bears mentioning here today. In 1935, under a pseudonym, Agostini, he wrote The Problems of War, about the Ethiopian war at the time going on in Italy, well, in Africa. He wrote, "There is a notable absence of enthusiasm, even among volunteers. Enlistment is an entirely calculated way of swapping their present unemployment for a job they hope will be lucrative and not very dangerous. They think that if the war were to become serious, they would be called up anyway. And that until it is serious, they have everything to gain and little to lose. They go to war in the spirit of mercenaries. I believe the strongest climate of opposition is to be found among the middle classes, where there is a feeling more widespread now than ever, and confirmed on this occasion, that they are at the mercy of a despotic will over which they have no control. For days, families watched their sons going off in the yoke of a simple postcard call-up without knowing anything about their destination, without so much as a line in the newspapers. And suddenly there was a sense of panic. The muttering immediately began to get louder. Reassuring statements have quite naturally caused the anxiety to increase. Again, there is no, this is not to overstate these phenomena, but perhaps on this occasion, more than ever, the Italian middle classes have the feeling that the chickens have come home to roost, and that fascism, for which they sold their souls as a guarantee against socialism, will bring ruin even to them." Now, why do I quote this passage? Without making a simple one-to-one equation between fascism and modern day nationalist populist movements and authoritarian regimes, though it would not be difficult to make such connections, Colorni many years ago highlighted for us what the fears of people, that allows them to tolerate authoritarian regimes as a sense of protection will ultimately engulf them as well. When we think of, for instance, in America, the way Trump rode to power on a wave of grievances, only to leave power by threatening to overturn the very democratic system upon which 70 million plus Americans sought to elect him, then Colorni's warning against being taken in by the grievance politics of authoritarians of the past seem even more important today. These are just some of the reasons why Colorni remains critical today and why the translation and publication of his work into English is such a needed achievement. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Ernest. Our next speaker and one of the two directors of the series, Nicoletta Stame, comes to us from a long career at the University of Rome La Sapienza in the Department of Communication and Social Research. And now, Nicoletta.
Thank you, Anthony, and thank you, Ernest, for having introduced and so well understood what we were wanted to do, because you have picked up some points that are not only very actual, not only telling to how we live now, but you have linked the legacy of Colorni to our current understanding. So thank you very much. You have introduced us and you have said something that allows me to say why we are doing all this. And first of all, so what I will try to do today is simply to explain what is inside the book that we have been publishing. And so just a brief presentation, but in that spirit that you have presented to us. So first of all, thanks to Bordighera Press, that now we have this Colorni available in English. And as a Colorni-Hirschman International Institute, we stress the importance of Colorni as a critical thinker and the man of action, or for action, as he used to say, and the forerunner of possibilism, which is the way of thinking that Hirschman, his brother-in-law and follower, has been also master for us. With the celebration of the 100th anniversary of Colorni in 2009, his contribution to many fields of thought and his action were rediscovered in a sense. And he started being studied much more than before under different lenses, although somewhat separated. Our work on Colorni, both by studying him, publishing his works, is aimed at reconstructing through his thoughts, his writings, his teaching, his practice, a fight against what he called anthropomorphism and his possibilist approach, something that is alive in his legacy and in the work of those who have continued to follow his path. Our aim in this series is to show Colorni's possibilist thinking, how it unfolds, going through published and mainly unpublished essays in the period between 1935-44, and we present Colorni how Colorni was open to various fields, from philosophy to psychology to arts to physics, and from political thinking to active participation in the anti-fascist policies and in the resistance. His questioning and exploratory style was characterized by being always illuminated by a guiding inspiration, brotherhood, a civilizing trend, what he called the incivilimento, federation, what he considered some basic position, which is it would be enough to have clear in one's heart, and I would say in one's instinct, unquote, and then proceeding by doubting, trying to understand how things were evolving, refining his strategy in order to master these new things. He was against models and paradigms, and he was open to surprise and new solutions. The years covered in our series were spent by Colorni as a clandestine anti-fascist and socialist militant, being a philosophy teacher and an underground socialist organizer at the same time when he was in Trieste in the years 35-38, then in prison where he went owing to the anti-Jewish laws in 38, and then in confinement in Ventotene and Melfi, 1939-43, and then as a socialist and federalist organizer during the Roman resistance. Each book in the series deals with a group of writings centered around the main focus, but showing the link with the vast area of Colorni's interest. And I will tell you a few words about the 4 books. The first one, Critical Thinking in Action, is a first mini anthology of Eugenio's political writings that covers the whole of the period. And it presents a few milestones in this route. A first block of writings on what he called the fight of fascism under fascism. Fight fascism under fascism, fight fascism while living under fascism. And what you have mentioned before, the feeling that the people had against the war of Abyssinia, etc., enters there. But here also there is this wonderful piece on the function of the teacher in the fascist school, which is a model of how to behave in a certain sense within fascism. Being really anti-fascist, but with a sense of being able to understand the life of the people who had no other environment, no other context in which they lived than fascism. So trying to undermine, trying to make them understand what could be changed in that situation. Then there is a block of writings about critical thinking and anthropomorphism, understanding, discovery, love, all this type of block of things that refer to his thinking during that period. And then there are these federalist writing of the period in Rome. And here you have mentioned, Ernest, the long piece by the Ventotene Manifesto. And here there are also letters from that period in which he explains very well his way of thinking, his view of federalism from below, not as a federalist constitution, but based on brotherhood. We called it affratellamento, freedom, social justice, universalism, and aiming at influencing the behavior of the victorious powers in the post-war Europe period, which was, he was aiming at that. He was trying to imagine what might have happened after the war. Then the discovery of the possible is more devoted to cultural and to the political writings, and based mostly, or very much, on the correspondence to Ursula, which is an astonishing piece of his. And it offers various aspects of Eugenio's mental attitude and ideas based on the need for cultural and political liberation, for creating a new way of thinking. He was thinking that things would have changed, and he was afraid of the old ways of thinking inside the anti-fascist parties. And so he tried to provide in many fields. And there are different types of articles, directives to anti-fascist militants, organizational activities, very minute, in which he says what they should do. Other pieces are again on the interest of the discoveries, especially in the natural sciences and physics and literary criticism, that are the type of fields he was interested in that period, linked to his political ideas. And then again, federalism as something that would allow to overcome the old ideas. Then there are the dialogues, and the dialogues is a very interesting book. It's something that we have found new things. So there are a lot of previously unpublished papers. It is a dialogue is by Eugenio Colorni and Altiero Spinelli. The dialogues allow us to understand how emotionally and intellectually engaging was the life of this group of people in the Ventotene confinement. It has already been said, Colorni, Spinelli, Ernesto Rossi, and Ursula Hirschman, and a few others. During the day, they were discussing great themes, systems, finalism, ends and means. And at night, they were writing dialogues in which each writer interpreted what all the participants had said. So Altiero wrote about himself, Severus, and about Eugenio, Commodus, and the other way around. So it's very interesting how they use this form of dialogue as a way of it's a kind of pedagogical function. They discussed and learned reciprocally. They acknowledged the differences. They had this idea that inside the movement, it is possible to have different ideas and to find common points together. And they were against, especially Ernest, against an imposition of an ideology from above. But these dialogues that are mainly very interesting also the period, because they start in 39 and they reflect on what is going on during the war, and they start developing their own ideas on the European Federation. So one can follow through the fact that they are talking about great system, how also their political ideas were unfolding. And then there is the final year, which is 43, 44, which reproduces political traits, journal articles, correspondence of this fiery beginning of the Roman resistance, when Eugenio was a clandestine organizer of the socialist youth, for whom he was a hero, a comrade, a teacher at the same time. We know that he was holding lessons for this group of young socialists, but unfortunately his lessons are lost. But what we know is that he was at the same time preparing for military action and speaking of a great problem of humanity and continuing in his study on philosophy and physics. So this was the way of this kind of personality, which had so many possible ways of expressing himself, and also being such a teacher and someone whom everybody remembers, those who have lived at that time with him, as someone who has inspired them in such a way that have helped them also overcome various ideas and greatly better grasp what was going on. And this period testifies of how Eugenio's previous ideas on European Federation is a typical example of how he was refining his ideas. He had his own previous ideas, and then seeing that how things were moving, were changing, he came to adapt them to the new situation. And so he continuously adapted and tested, and in the end, these ideas on European Federation became a guide for action and a guide for organizing the armed struggle, for building alliances with the political parties. Also his ability to exploit the crisis within the fascist elements, to be able to find someone who could help him, because he understood that the fascism was in crisis and it was possible to make some inroads into there, to find alliances, especially for what would happen later on. And then the elaboration of a federalist policies suited to the new situation of a people that was fighting for its own liberation from the Nazi occupation, but was well aware of the problems that would emerge with the winning powers. And the letter, he also, Ernest quoted something of this kind, when he said that the winning powers will have to choose between an imperialist policy or one of unity with the vanquished. And Colorni thought it was in the power of the peoples of Europe to force the winning powers to come out of their nationalistic shell and to set in motion, even in spite of themselves, a policy of European unification. In this short sentence, there is the nut of what he was thinking and of his strategy and his ability to enter into the situation and try to change things, but also in the power of the people to force the winning power. So this federalism from below that he was trying to propose and that he saw as the moment and the policy of the moment. So what to say from all this presentation of all what is found in these books at the same time, I think my personal feeling is that working on Colorni's mental attitude and practice is a continuous source of inspiration, certainly not an archaeological study of something that happened ages ago. Colorni's liberal, socialist, democratic perspective is a way of keeping alive our search for a better world.
Thank you, Nicoletta. Our next speaker is Michael Gilmartin, who is a translator, one of the people responsible for bringing Colorni to us in the English-speaking world. And will talk to us just about some of the challenges of translating in general, but translating someone like Colorni, considering some of the profound thoughts that he has expressed. Michael.
Thank you, Anthony. Well, I want to say something very briefly about translating in general and about these translations in particular. But first of all, I want to say how grateful I am to Luca and Nicoletta for introducing me to this amazing person, Eugenio Colorni. And also, I want to say I'm really enjoying doing these translations. I like translating in general because it's a challenge. It's like solving a puzzle. And when the material is as varied and fascinating as this, there's real satisfaction in working towards getting it right. The challenge of translating is that you can get a message, a feeling, an intention from the original text. Then you try and put it into English, and what comes out is often flat and colorless, like a superficial, slightly awkward paraphrase of the original. The problem is that the two languages are often so different in the way they express things that it's like the old story of the square peg and the round hole. So you go back and forth between the Italian and the English, fiddling with it and improving it where you can. But the irony is that even though everything you're trying to express comes from the Italian text, at a certain point, it's the Italian that's holding you back. And quite often you can't really go any further until you escape from the influence of the Italian and let the English take over and do things its own way, you might say. So at the end of a text, when it's been translated, what I do is I leave it for a day and then I come back and see how it sounds when I no longer have the Italian in my ear. And this makes it much easier to see what changes need to be made. But one element that's important not to lose in the English version is the voice of the author. In this series, there are really just two authors, apart from Altiero Spinelli in dialogues. Now, one of them is Luca Meldolesi. And when I read him in Italian, I hear him explaining, I hear him persuading and always making sure the reader stays with him. And what also comes across when he does this is his infectious enthusiasm. You can just feel how much he cares for his subject. And of course, this is one of the things that makes his introduction so good. And so what I have to do is try and speak with this same voice and try and ensure that all these things are still there in the English. And this subject of Luca's, of course, is the other author, Eugenio Colorni. With him, there are two main features that come across to me as fundamental and that need to be preserved in the English version. One is the energy and vitality you feel when he's arguing his case. And when you read him, you understand that he put this into everything he did, whether it's political organizing or science or school teaching. It's his commitment and urgency that you feel. The other fundamental element is what I would call Colorni's human empathy. You get this reassuring sense from reading him that after all of us are in this together. And this runs through a great deal of what he writes. Of course, you see it plainly in his amazing letters to Ursula from prison, where he offers insights on an incredibly vast range of subjects: biology, psychology, philosophy, literature. And he does it in a voice that's personal but selfless and always reaching out. And this is what I think he himself is talking about in his last will, in his message to his girls, his daughters, where he tells them that love is the most important thing there is. And that what loving means is letting another person be who they are, and that who they are is someone very different from you. And another place where you see this is in Colorni's disagreements with Altiero Spinelli, whom he criticizes quite harshly and directly. But along with the exasperation, there's always that undertone of empathy and human connection that he obviously feels for his old friend and comrade. It's the same selfless generosity of spirit he shows when he's guiding the young socialists under his command during the Roman resistance. But the remarkable thing to me is how he applies this empathy in his ideas about how we gain knowledge in general. The idea that if you want to understand anything, you have to let it be what it is, and not what you think it ought to be or what you would like it to be. I've noticed that this actually happens in translating, that sometimes I say, oh, okay, I see where he's going here. And in fact, it wasn't where he was going at all. So I misinterpret a phrase because my expectation caused me to make a wrong prediction. Colorni would say, don't try to make predictions, just let things be what they are. And this is, I guess, what possibilism is based on, this taking care to keep a truly open mind. And as I say, it translates into a sort of empathy that runs through most of Colorni's writings. And trying to make sure this is not lost is, for me, a big part of getting the English version right. So that's what I wanted to say. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Michael. Our next three speakers are just going to talk in general about Colorni's legacy. And I want to say that for those of you listening, if you would like to ask questions, you can do so in the Q&A. And then once we've heard from everyone, we can address those. And the other thing I want to mention is that Colorni was only 35 when he left us, when he was killed, and yet has left a significant legacy. So I just wanted to point that out. So our next speaker is Chiara Pulvirenti. Chiara.
Good evening. First of all, let me thank you for having me here. I'm particularly glad to talk about these books about Colorni because he was the first figure I studied as a historian, considering mainly the role he played in writing together with Ernesto Rossi and Altiero Spinelli and Ursula Hirschman, the Manifesto of the European Federalism in Ventotene. However, until now, these figures seem to be elusive. I studied a part of his correspondence with Ursula Hirschman, Altiero Spinelli, and Ernesto Rossi. I read papers, memories, police documents about him, but the documentation was too fragmented to grasp the political path of this eclectic man. He was a philosopher, a man of action, a politician, and as Spinelli was used to say, he was one that was not among those who had found, but among those who were looking for. Then I received the documents collected by Luca Meldolesi and Nicoletta Stame, and everything became more evident. Reading this collection of the Colorni papers, I finally understood his political proposals' modernity, even beyond the famous manifesto. In the last few years of historical research, I became more and more persuaded of the necessity to commute some traditional historical categories and periodization of the 20th century. And the Colorni papers give me the confirmation of this necessity. I will talk about it in my brief speak. In 2016, Mariuccio Salvati, an Italian historian who studied the partisan resistance and anti-fascism, edited a collection of essays entitled Passaggi, Transitions, Italians from the Fascism to the Republic. In this book, she invites historians to reconsider the Italian transition to democracy, including that young generation who grew up during the totalitarian regime and developed an anti-fascist attitude only in the 30s after the Italian aggression of Ethiopia in 1935. It was the beginning of the Italian crisis decade, which had its acme during the Second World War and led to the end of fascism, the Allied occupation, the partisan fight, the Civil War, and the Republic's birth. I believe that we should reconnect those years of the birth of the Republic to the crisis decade. It is necessary to understand that not always ideological anti-fascist roots of the new democracy and the global context where a political grammar and practices of renewal took place. Intellectuals made it, economists, technicians, scientists, philosophers, dialoguing to avoid totalitarianism and a new war. I believe that Eugenio Colorni could be included in that group. Eugenio Colorni's thinking is the thinking of the crisis, The colornist doubt able to motivate action is the thinking of the crisis. The possibilism of Albert Hirschman has its roots in the thinking of the crisis. In the second issue of the Unità Europea, published in the volume Critical Thinking in Action, Colorni highlights the crisis' redemptive value. In August 1943, after the fall of Mussolini, he wrote, "Today, the Italian people begin once again to think. They began thinking at the most difficult moment of their history. They had to fall right to the bottom of the abyss to find the genuineness and self-confidence they had lost." It was a second risorgimento. And as well as during the Italian unification process, conspirators from outside, exiles, prisoners were decisive in planning a new political proposal. Moreover, as well as in the 19th century, the lack of a dialogue with the new generation was the primary cause of failures and mistakes. In the preface to Problems of the European Federation, Colorni seems aware of these virtues and limits of the anti-fascist action, and he writes, "The isolation from concrete political activity allowed for a more detached view and suggested a review of traditional positions and a search for reasons for past failures in the efficiency in the general approach and in having committed the struggle to the usual fault lines, paying too little attention to what was new and was altering the situation." I found many common points between the Risorgimento refugees' writings about failures and the Colorni ones. According to Colorni, planning the future from outside, what Albert Hirschman called the condition of exit, was the cause of a sin that was very common among those forced to practice politics in prison, confinement, or exile. It is the sin of the ideology. He tries to think about the possibility of democracy outside parties, able to overcome national divisions. His idea seems very close to the anti-party attitude of a part of the Italian actionism. In particular, it seems similar to the one of the supporters of the so-called Third World, who considered a new rational language, the myth of the plan, and the experimental attitude, the best alternatives to the irrational language of the ideologies. On this issue, I found interesting a letter to Spinelli of May 1943. It is included in the volume The Discovery of the Possible, and there Colorni described an idea of politics that seems closer to the American democratic pragmatism. It is the letter where he criticized the Pantagruelic attitude of Spinelli. He writes, "Politics, in my view, will not move forward by retouching its ideological structure, setting out the formulation and solution for eternal problems, but by keeping its eyes on developing events. The new politician and scientists should ground their actions on analyzing reality, which let them see future tendencies. Colorni believes that even historians should profit in the same way from the same approach. Even if his idea of history could be questionable, it is useful to understand his faith in the scientific method and his experimental attitude." In the dialogue on anthropomorphism in the sciences, he asserted, the third way of writing history is the good and the true and the right one. True history as experienced living and working history, in which the past is your past. And precisely for this reason, it is articulated towards the future, not as prediction, but as tendency, a push, a positioning of ends. It is the myth of the experimental approach, and it is the connection between the unlucky story of Colorni and the stories of all those technicians, economists, sociologists, urbanists, who were the protagonists of the second half of the 20th century, carrying on the myth of planning and the rush to development. The experimental attitude is the key concept to understand the Colorni ideas of the new political activism, but it is also the key to understand the political proposal of an entire generation who became anti-fascist during the crisis decade and would like to rebuild a scrambled world after the war, producing plans and programs of recovery in the name of social justice. Eugenio Colorni had already been killed before the end of the war, but his legacy was still alive in the post-war, and it seems even more useful today in our times of crisis. Thank you more for this documents collection. They still have many lessons to teach new generations of economists, politicians, and historians too. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Osvaldo Feinstein. Osvaldo.
Thank you. Thank you. In fact, I am learning a lot by listening to the previous colleagues and friends. I appreciate very much the opportunity to participate in this webinar celebrating the publication of these valuable books. Let me restrict my comments to two of the books, Critical Thinking in Action and The Discovery of the Possible. These books provide the reader not only with the possibility of starting to get acquainted with Eugenio Colorni's extraordinary life and thought, but also to have a deeper knowledge of Albert Hirschman's work and to get insights from Luca Meldolesi and Nicoletta Stame's Colorni-Hirschmanian journey. The influence of Colorni on Hirschman has been superbly presented by Luca, and I have nothing to add. But I would like to share with you some observations triggered by reading these two books, The Critical Thinking in Action and Discovery of the Possible. The first observation is the way in which Colorni developed his own perspective through reading critically and creatively books of science, philosophy, and literature. Thus, in part 2 of The Discovery of the Possible, there are notes by Colorni on his readings of more than 20 authors, most of them non-Italian, like Reichenbach in science, Hegel in philosophy, and Thomas Mann in literature, among several other more. And all of them, or most of them, read while he was in jail or on confinement. One is reminded of another great Italian philosopher and activist who was also jailed in Italy during the first half of the 20th century, and who read and wrote while in prison, Antonio Gramsci. And Gramsci wrote about the importance of constructing a personal viewpoint, something that Colorni did in a masterful way. In fact, the first book that I was mentioning, Critical Thinking in Action, could be taken as critical and creative thinking in action, because he combined both aspects. And sometimes we have critical thinking without creative thinking, and vice versa. And Colorni combined both. The second observation is that in the long introductory essay written by Luca for the Discovery book, we can get a glimpse not only of Colorni's life and thought, but also of Luca's and Nicoletta's application of Colorni's and Hirschman's insights to their teaching and orientation of an Italian generation of students who have become innovative entrepreneurs in the public and private sector, promoting social change. So this is very interesting because it's not only economists, historians, social scientists, but also entrepreneurs in the public and private sector. And I think this is really extraordinary, and I can see now the roots of these efforts that I had the privilege to see myself directly in Italy, that in a way, they are linked to not only to Hirschman, but also to Colorni in direct and indirect ways. Furthermore, both books include several reflections about nationalism and federalism, which are relevant nowadays for ongoing discussions about both themes, not only in Europe, but also in Latin America and in different parts of Latin America. Perhaps if there are some questions afterwards, I will be very keen in elaborating on this. So reading the pages of these books, including its fascinating footnotes, has been for me a source of delight and insights. So thank you, Luca and Nicoletta, for editing these extraordinary books. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Osvaldo. Thank you.
Thank you, Osvaldo.
Our next speaker is Valeria Aniello. And Valeria, may I ask you to unmute yourself?
Okay, can you hear me?
Yeah,
okay.
All yours.
Okay, thank you for inviting me to this important meeting today. I want to highlight the legacy of a personality such as Colorni. He produced key teachings for the benefit of an entire generation of intellectuals. In particular, I want to analyze Colorni's legacy on Albert Hirschman, an economist like me, at the center of our institute's activities, who I studied before Colorni himself. So this is important for me. In order to do so, I begin with the concept that Colorni described very well and which highlights the maiotic value of his teaching, anthropomorphism in the science, as a limit to human understanding and knowledge. In some of his philosophical writings, Colorni explained that the human perception is linked to each person's condition. If a man had 17 arms instead of 2, his perception of the world would change. He would then be looking for something to which, with only 2 arms, he would not have access, because as Colorni says, we see only what we search. Thus, there are many things we don't search because we don't see them, and yet they exist. It's important to be aware that there are different perceptions because this awareness put us in a condition of discovery and empathy with the world around us. So it's not surprising that Colorni, despite being acknowledged anti-fascist and fighter, devised free teaching strategies without coming into open conflict with the fascist ideals in school, trying this way to surgically reach the new generations. Also, he tried to combine general knowledge of the whole with particular knowledge, working on his own perceptive condition. Colorni, in my opinion, made a revolution on the way of doing research and producing knowledge with this simple image, the man with 17 arms. Where did I find this Colornian approach in Hirschman? Hirschman also stands us as an intellectual without certitudes, without a Weltanschauung, as some family narratives report. Hirschman also cultivates and practices a constant questioning of some of his cognitive frameworks. 2 examples for all. The first, the exit voice pattern, elaborated for the first time in his 1982 book, Loyalty, Defection, and Protest. This pattern was used to understand the mechanisms to remedy the crisis of organization, company, state, political parties. The first option is the exit from the organization. The second is what Hirschman calls voice. For example, protests inside the organization. But just when this fascinating pattern has captured the reader and seemed to be an unquestionable discovery, Hirschman surprised us. And after a few years, he feels the need to revise it in 1989, following the fall of the Berlin Wall. The second example comes from Albert Hirschman's book, Rhetoric of Reaction of 1991, in which Hirschman tells us about 2 centuries of history seen by analyzing the reactionary rhetoric against change. He identifies 3 types of arguments used by the conservative thought. The thesis of perversity. Change will generate perverse effects. Futility, change will have no effect. And jeopardy, change will cause damage. But just when we feel convinced by this thesis, Hirschman in the final chapter decides to change his perspective, to go from the 2 arms to 17 arms, highlighting how even progressive rhetoric is not immune to similar opposite arguments. Colorni and Hirschman thus give us the figure of an intellectual who bases his research on his condition, and this condition changes more or less intentionally. Therefore, the intellectual modifies thought. Sometimes he is self-subverting, showing us that it's not inevitable that we grow old or die in terms of knowledge. Thank you.
Thank you, Valeria. Thank you. And now let's ask Luca to sort of close out this part, and who is also Luca Meldolesi is also the co-director of the series. And as you've heard from a couple of our speakers, he's also has written, has introduced a couple of the books. Luca.
Yes. I don't know how much you want to know. This is the problem. It is important that we will have time to reread or to understand what you have been saying, because it's also something significant that we talk to each other. This is something new. These are books that have come out slowly, in time and so on, and all my introduction was but it's also interesting to say that each time you find something else, and so the game continues. There is no end in sight. So after these 4 books, there are another 3 books already coming. One is more philosophical, as some very important essays of Eugenio. Another one is on arts and politics. I'm working now at the moment on arts and politics. And this is very new for me because, my mother was an artist. So I had all life a problem, what to do with art. And now I start understanding, slowly understanding my mistakes in life on the subject. And then, of course, there is this great problem of philosophy that, Eugenio was working on Leibniz for 8 years, and true is, at the core of the story is the fact that he was revolting against the solution that the philosophers, have made of of the great discipline. And in reading and working on that, I find, as an economist, because I'm an economist, that is typically the same problem that the communists have. I spent a long time of my life in trying to criticize the economic theory, sort of mainstream economic theory, neoclassical economic theory, and in fact, I was wrong, because in fact it's not the problem of finding a way of criticizing them, but the wrong thing is to have that. For Colorni and for Hirschman, they don't want to have a system, a solution. So Hegel and Barras are on this on the same foot, and this is a way of liberating our thinking from a structure that has dominated in the West for centuries by now. So this is, I say this because when Ernesto quoted this article of the 35, this is the first article, political article published in the Avanti in Paris, and Eugenio at that point is only 26, and in the Socialist Party they were so surprised that a young man was coming out with something very fresh and very convincing and interesting, and even the communists were discussing this. They're sort of used to have a sort of long ideological pieces and so on. Well, it was able to get the situation as clear as Ernest was reproducing. So, in fact, the liberation of thinking is enormously important for these people. And the reason is that they found themselves in such a tragedy that the responsibility of this greatest tragedy of the modern time, from the war to the Holocaust and so on, is not simply of the politician or of the inability, it's also of the intellectuals. So, and this is very important for us, because in thinking and in struggling and in doing things, we have to have a responsible path, what we are doing. So, in fact, what Valeria was saying about the fact that, coming back to the limits of the human being and what he can understand, what find the ability of self-criticizing, or as Hirschman said, subservation. This is very significant. There is a page by Colorni in which one says that sincerity is the key. Sincerity for yourself, to be able to tell what you are doing, in fact, and to be responsible for what you effectively are doing. And this is not common in the intellectuals. It's not normal around. So now I tend to talk too much. So I just want to say that, probably have heard that this idea of Albert Hirschman of reform mongering, that is possibly as reform mongering, a way of looking for reforms and so on. And, in working with Colorni, I came across the idea that this is true, but this should be for everybody. It's not simply for government, not for, it's something that everybody has to, put the mind and its activity in it. So I made a little, the story started like that. I had a group of students, and I wanted to teach them some Colorni stories. So I put up a little writing and saying Colorni per tutti, for everybody, not for a single person, for everybody. And so this has been very important in our story, and Valeria was remembering that, and also Osvaldo was saying that we have been able to bring up a generation of people of the Italian South, starting from Naples, but then also in Sicily and also in Calabria and so on. And people who have in their heart this idea that while you are working in this world, you think also to the possible better world to be built. Okay, so this dual connection is arrived in various realms of life, and particularly in managerial, entrepreneurial, and teaching activities. So this is how this institute came about. The institute is simply the result of this, and we thank very much the Bordighera Press, because through them we tend to try to tell to everybody. Everybody, not only Italians, but everybody of the world. So, of course, we would like now to, we have been already doing conferences we've done in Boston, in Washington, and in Berlin. Now we would like to have one in Latin America, probably in Bogota, and so on. So, because we think that the great story of Colorni is teaching what to think and what to do. And this is not normal. Okay, that's it.
Thank you, Luca.
Thank you.
As you were speaking, and as I was reminded of what some of our other speakers have said, that it seems to me that there's this underlying theme of the benefits of looking back. That is, the benefits of looking at quote unquote older voices, not so much just to see what they said, but to see how we might, again, to use the word, benefit from those older voices. And I'm reminded, of course, my own work, which is in literature and cinema studies and semiotics, is that, we think of the great semioticians of today or the 20th century, i.e. Umberto Eco, but we can go back to Charles Morris, the Sanders Peirce, et cetera, and arrive at Aristotle and find things in Aristotle that are still useful today, right? So, and this seems to me to be what I've heard from you all is one of the benefits of looking back at Colorni, that there are things still from which we can benefit intellectually as interpretive keys and things of that sort. So I would start out with that observation.
Yes. Okay. So it's
and the rest of you should unmute so we can maybe have a conversation amongst ourselves. I don't see any. I don't know if anyone has any questions. Those who are listening to us, I do see a question now. There is one. So this is from one of our friends and colleagues at CUNY, Dani Kiriko, and she says, "I'm not deeply familiar with Colorni's early writings. Given that Leibniz was deeply influenced by Spinoza, such as the argument for an immanent immanent versus transcendental God, is this seen in Colorni's work, perhaps as an influence of his Jewish roots?" I don't know who wants to take that one.
Yeah, well, what I can say is that philosophy has been very much influenced by the discoveries of the physics, and this was true for a great period of time. And Colorni was very much interested in that. That is Leibniz and Descartes, Cartesio, were still, people who have been in the great tradition of knowing everything. The division of labor was limited at the time, and made the discoveries in mathematics, both, Descartes and Leibniz. This somehow Colorni wanted to do the same thing for our time. That is, to learn from Einstein, for all the great Fermi and everybody else, a way for discovering, helping them to discover better. And he believed that if you fight against your conventional way of thinking and open the mind for new ways, so you are helping discoveries. So in fact, not simply that philosophy is influenced by the physics, but also he was hoping that transforming philosophy that will have also the discoveries. I think this is a process that can be developed also for other disciplines. And I think Hirschman is basically this, you see. He was not wanting to tell why and how he was doing what he was doing. Once he told me that people were asking him, how do you get so many ideas? And he asked me, what would you answer to that? And of course I said, well, I just laughed. But the truth was that, if you keep your mind open, then you can discover something new. And of course, what all of us should do is to do something good and something new. And Hirschman was telling me, either it's good but it's not new, or it's new but it's not good. This is most what the intellectual do, and that's is a mistake. So this is very much in the story, you see. Looking at the discoveries of the other people is a way of learning how to discover yourself.
Okay. There's another question. Does somebody someone else of the panelists want to take a shot at that? Is Osvaldo, are you raising your hand?
Yes, I wanted just to mention that in the book on the discovery of the possible, there is a letter to Ursula where Colorni refers to his reading of Spinoza and the way in which that reading stimulated him to think the way in which ideas emerge. I found that quite interesting. And by the way, as you mentioned Umberto Eco, I think it's interesting. Well, first, Eco's thesis was about the Middle Ages, so he went quite back. But second, I think it's very interesting the way in which Eco approached the reader. And Colorni is an extraordinary example of a reader, a creative reader, a critical and creative reader. Thank you.
Great, thank you. We have there's a question that I'm gonna read it. It's from Valeria. I have to put my glasses. Valeria Sagiomo.
Yes.
I really appreciated this webinar, especially Valeria Aniello's recall of the Colorni image of the man with 17 arms. I have the feeling that this image is very near to Amartya Sen capabilities approach that was fundamental for him to build a theory of human development, so present in development agendas. My question is, was Amartya Sen influenced by Colorni? In the end, he married Eva Colorni. Thank you.
One thing should be said that Eva Colorni was probably the very gifted, probably the most gifted daughter of Eugenio. And it's been really tragedy of this illness and then his death. I don't know really how much of Colorni passed through her to Omorto. What I would say, I would know, simply say that Omorto doesn't know Italian, so I would expect that it's not very learned on Colorni yet. But now we will have the possibility of doing so. Yes. Okay.
Exactly. Okay. Okay. So I think that's no other questions right now. We still have a large group of people, but there are no other questions. Is there among the panelists, is there anything else that you'd like to add? I appreciate Osvaldo's reference to Umberto Eco and the reader. The reader, it's part of what I do, and so Eco's been a big influence.
Well, I'm looking forward to the next volume on art and politics very much because of my own interests. And I think it was Osvaldo who mentioned that reading Colorni reminded him of another writer in prison, Antonio Gramsci, who, of course, also wrote on art and politics and the use of politics to deliver ideas as broadly as possible. So I'm very interested in seeing what Colorni's contributions were to art and politics when this volume comes out. And I don't know if Bordighera has a continuing plan to publish other volumes, but I'll read in Italian or English, however it comes out.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. No. We have the plan. The plans are still. Actually, we should, Luca and Nicoletta. We should recognize actually. Il Galeotto fu libro e chi lo si. We should recognize Nicolò D'Aquino, who is a mutual friend of ours, who's a journalist from Italy and who's also worked in the United States, who actually brought us together, introduced us to each other a few years ago. So so part of the glory or some of the
I think he's in the audience. He must be in the audience.
He might be, yeah.
Yeah.
So, but no, you're right, Ernest. I think that whole idea of art and politics, Gramsci, etc., it's a really intriguing connection there, or whatever coincidence. Let's put it that way. Coincidence of these two thinkers who wrote a lot from there. It's also interesting that Colorni's first book, if I'm not mistaken, was on Benedetto Croce, right?
Yes, that's it. Yes.
So, he actually started out in that way, that is looking at what we might say interpretation theory, things of that sort. Yeah.
I can tell you some element of the story. That is, Colorni was very, very young, and as a student, he wrote three important papers for Borghese, who was his teacher of aesthetics.
And it has been in the United States for a long time.
Who has been done in the United States and so on and so forth. these three things are very interesting because actually one feel that is starting a process by which undermining Croce is somehow undermining the overall thinking, you see. And this is the reason why it's never been Marxist, because in fact it was struggling against Hegel and then connecting this to what the other people were saying and so on. So actually it was very close to the socialists. He had many communist friends and so on. But it was always explaining that his way of developing his ideas were coming right from the beginning. So the influence of Croce on the communists has been very significant, while in Colorni his early writing demonstrate that he was going out of that. Mm-hmm. And this is somehow, what I was saying before, that is sort of a revolt against the culture that dominates the time of the 30s. This is certainly very important in the story. And this is a philosophical writing on arts. But then there are many other little pieces that are very amusing and interesting, that is, come out here and there in letters, or also he has written a couple of novels, So in fact, this man was able to go around very much. There is even a letter in which he says to Ursula, he says, I start with philosophy, then I go to physics, then I read Shakespeare, then I do something else. I have the impression of doing nothing, but I am happy. That's it. That's it.
And I should say he wrote his book on Croce. He was very young, right? He was in his 20s. He was 23 or 24, I think, when he published that book. And it's so we need to look at then what you're saying, Luca, is that we need to look forward to reading also some of his fiction and seeing
how
his fiction dialogues with his philosophical writing.
Very soon, and it depends also on Michael. Oh, is then number 5. Then this is the 6. Okay, the 5 is already finished. 5th is already in his hands, and you are in the middle of the story.
Exactly.
Yes.
Hey, Anthony, I do have a broader question, unless there's somebody else already in the queue.
No, we're good.
I wanted to ask the panelists or whoever's paying attention, because we only lightly touched on it in today's meeting. It strikes me that Colorni was a double victim of fascism, as a socialist and a Jew. And so how much of his political outlook and his response to fascism was rooted in his socialism versus being an Italian Jew and directly targeted by the racial laws? I'd be curious to hear what the experts' feelings on this are.
Well, you see, both families, the family of Eugenio and the family of Albert-Hirschman, are of Jewish origin, but they've been baptized, this sort of thing. So in the Risorgimento, as you know, they've been liberated, and actually they kept connections as families of Jewish origin, and this certainly is a strong element in both lives. Because since the Jew knew that the education and the work at the professional level was very important, both families were actually of this kind. One was a doctor and the other one was a entrepreneur. And also the rest of the family, for instance, the Sereni family, very important for Eugenio. The Sereni family was also a doctor of the King of Italy. So, this is sort of high level in which they start their activity and so on. The tragedy is that, as you know, this process that started in Germany arrived in Italy in 1938, and Eugenio was arrested. Albert escaped by chance because he was having a day off in the Alps that day. Otherwise, would have been taken as well. I mean, we are very close with this story, also because in Berlin, as you know, now they've started having a movement of minimalist movement on the tragedy of the Jewish. And this has also been taken into Italy, and also in Rome, we have the same story. And I think this translation of Colorni is also important for the Germans, because Wolf Lepenies was a very important intellectual of Europe now at the moment, has written to us a letter saying that these books are very precious because it gives you the way of understanding much more the process in which all this has developed. So this is, I think, important. Also, I hope for the Levi.
Primo Levi.
Primo Levi. Center, yes, in New York.
So Luca, are the translations into English the first time Colorni is being translated?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Only some little pieces,
yes,
the introduction of the manifesto, but and also sometimes they've been translated something else and called the Colorni, but was wrong. So in fact, it's only the first time that this is coming out. So I think this is also interesting for, Wolf Lepenies has written an important book. Albert Hirschman recognized this in Princeton, and when Albert was at the institute, and this is on the German culture and the responsibility of the German culture on what has happened. You see.
Mm-hmm.
And now, of course, the responsibilities of the German culture, but also the Italian culture, also the French culture. So this is a process that has to continue, and of course, this is a little contribution to this. Necessary, what you were saying, in fact, that we need to come out of the nationalism. This is a problem of the world. It's not a problem of a single part of it.
Mm-hmm.
This is something that is very important. So what we are actually doing is, while we try to make Europe, help Europe to develop and so on, this is of course in the Spinelli tradition. Even the Italian Prime Minister now is in the Spinelli tradition, okay? But also we have to be more active in developing for a new world that should come out of all this, you see. And this is very much in the Colorni tradition. So I think this also the dialogue between Colorni and Spinelli is very present in modern time. And you know, perhaps the people who are working for the United Nations and the tragedy of yesterday of the ambassador, Italian ambassador in Congo, and so on.
Yeah.
They should know that there is a perspective in what they are doing. It's not simply a well-being or a religious. It's a process that is so important for the future generations. This is very much Colorni.
Yeah, Chiara had her hand up. And Chiara, if you can, oh, you've already unmuted, good.
Yes, just a few words about the double condition of Colorni, of being a socialist and Jewish. When he was arrested at the beginning, the fascist propaganda gave highlights this arrest because he was at the same time a Jewish and a socialist. But at the end, he was considered just an anti-fascist. So it has a great value for the propaganda, the fact that he was fascist and Jewish. And also because it was the beginning of the anti-Jewish laws in Italy in that moment. So it is an important, I think, aspect of his condition. Even if then he was sent to the confinement as a normal anti-fascist.
You know, I think I wanted to bring this up is because despite the fact that he was, you know, assimilated and very much buying into the Italian tradition of the Risorgimento and liberalism and the Colorni witnessed the coming to power of the Nazis in Germany on the basis of the systematic persecution of Jews. Hitler's words coming to power, and he had to leave Germany in 33, I think it was.
Yes.
And whether he identified as a Jew or he practiced, you know, kept Sabbath or not, at the end of the day, the fascist anti-racist laws were pretty explicit. It doesn't matter how you identify, it's how they identify you. And he must have recognized that this broad attack, regardless of his own choices, stripped him of his choices. And not just as an Italian Jew, others were targeted based on how they were perceived by these authoritarian regimes. I only bring that up because I think, and I'm just speculating here, and you know what, since we're at the Calandra Institute, I can make it a much more broad statement. One never knows what your multiple identities are until others start imposing their viewpoints on you.
Yeah.
So I am not for one moment associating being an Italian in America with being a Jew in fascist Italy. I'm not doing that. But I must say that I feel particularly, my own experiences as originally from Canada, I feel pretty Canadian when I'm discussing American views on healthcare. Being an Italian in America, I feel pretty Italian when I speak to people who have views about Italian Americans or Italians who are themselves not Italian. And views that I may not agree with. So I just wonder if that must have gone through Colorni's mind, where all of a sudden he's being arrested, where yesterday he was just an Italian, and now today I'm a Jew.
This is not how things went. Actually, Colorni was doing a double life. And Ursula was helping him very much on that. So they were a couple of happy people going to opera and you know, playing tennis and so on. While at night he was helping, for instance, his cousin. This is very, very well-known story. Now, the day in which he was going to marry Ursula, his cousin came to Trieste to expatriate. So he went with Albert Hirschman at the station and told to Albert, if I don't come back, you should go back and say he has been caught. So this is not. So what the truth is that they were
was a Jewish
very,
cousin.
Yes, another good Jewish cousin. The truth was that they were very, very young, and they were doing incredible things. Incredible. You know, Hirschman had a, you know, he was bringing material from Paris all the time and using his passport openly because it was not caught by the Germans, you know. He flew from Berlin and was Eugenio who told him, you should go. You see?
As Ernest has just said, that he felt that he was in need.
Yes, but he understood that the problem was Albert, not him. I mean, he was a foreigner, so he went away and so on. It was taking time. But Albert was really, you know, could be taken the day after by the police and so on. So he convinced him to go. And this is a story that comes out in Exit and Voice, in fact, you know, in the German introduction. The German introduction of Exit and Voice, Albert confesses that after so much time, he has realized that he had the remorse of having gone away, even if that was very good. Indispensable, indispensable. Yes. You know, otherwise, you know, it was. So this is true. They were doing such incredible things. For instance, in Marseille, Albert Hirschman was forging passports all the time for European intellectuals and
mainly Jews,
many of them Jews, and pushing them to Spain to go to the United States. So this is the story. I mean, he went into the Spanish Civil War for a little while and saw the tragedy there, and then went back and wanted to see Eugenio, because Eugenio was older, 6 years, and for this reason was sort of older brother, yes.
Okay, thank you. Listen, we're coming up against our limit of time. We've been actually chatting for much longer than I had expected, but not as long as I'd hoped we could. But no, but it's really been good. I want to one more question quickly for our audience so they know what's coming up. We have you, Luca and Nicoletta. You said that volume 5 is already done. I'm assuming it's on its way to Bordighera Press. And
after
volume
Michael, yes.
Yeah.
and
Michael
volume
ends, yes.
is the arts and politics issue. Is that volume? Is that
The volume, the sixth volume I mean, I'm finishing it.
okay?
Then will come out in Italian, then will be translated, and then will
take some time.
Also. So
Okay.
for next year, then. Okay.
Good. Okay, well, I should say all 4 books are available. You can go online and find them at any of those online bookstores, or if you have a bookstore in your neighborhood, a local bookstore that you would like to instead, buy from, then perhaps you might want to go to the local bookstore and help out one of the local bookstore owners in your neighborhood. So with that, I want to thank everybody who to join us. We're at different parts. It's 10 of 2 here in the Northeast. It's 10 of I guess 8 in it's aperitivo time, or maybe it's past aperitivo time for those of you in Europe. We're past lunch here, and we have another couple of hours before we bump up into aperitivo time. But thank you all for joining. I want to thank especially Luca and Nicoletta for having the confidence in coming to us. Of course, thanks again to Niccolo D'Aquino and for staying with us. And we're looking forward to creating this series and to getting more and more books that come out. And I personally am looking forward to the arts and politics one, because in the literary and cinema studies that I do, Gramsci's name occasionally comes up. And so now I guess we're going to have Gramsci and Colorni coming up. Why not? Okay. So with that, I want to thank you all. Nicoletta and Luca, I'll be in touch in the next 24 hours. We'll chat. We'll have I'll let you know about the recording. For those of you who would like to share the recording, it should be in the next 24 hours to 48 hours available, and we'll let you all know. Okay.
And if you want to make questions or consideration, observation, and so on, feel free of corresponding and doing work. Okay, good.
Great.
Thank you very much.
Okay. All right. Goodbye, everybody.
Thank you.
You.
Bye.
Thanks.